Hey, everybody. Welcome to Odd and Untold, the podcast where we talk about all things strange and spooky. And this week, if you haven't guessed by my outfit here this week, we're getting back to some Bigfoot stuff. And this episode came about because this week, Josh and I were talking, my buddy Josh, who's been a guest on this show, been a co-host on this show multiple times now. We go camping a lot together. We've done probably a dozen trips together already, if not more. I'm trying to remember off the top of my head, but I can think of 12, but there's probably one or two more in there. Anyway, we were talking this week. We're trying to plan a camping trip coming up, and our schedules are just kind of rough right now. We're in September. His September is looking really booked. His October is looking really booked. The one weekend in October that he is free, I'm booked. So we were just talking, said, okay, let's look at September. Let's look at October. Now we're getting into November. So we said, all right, now we're looking at probably a winter camping trip, which we've done before. We've gone to John Pond and Fawn Lake. And what brought me to this podcast, we went to a place called Burnt Rossman Hills State Forest, and it's in the Catskills. And I've done a lot of talk on the show before about the Adirondack Mountains and the Adirondacks and Bigfoot in the Adirondacks, because it just is such a squatchy place, for lack of a better word. It's just very remote, very distant from any major cities. Albany is probably the closest one, which is, compared to New York City, not very big. But the Catskills in the Hudson River Valley also has lots of Bigfoot sightings. I've had Gail Beatty on the show from Bigfoot Researchers of the Hudson Valley, and she detailed some encounters. So I'll link to her show in the description below, so you can find that if you missed it. But she had some really cool stories from the Hudson River Valley of New York. And again, a lot of people don't think of New York when they think of Bigfoot. They think of the Pacific Northwest. They think of, Canada. But we have a lot of Bigfoot sightings here in New York, and we have them in the Catskills. So when I was talking to Josh this week, that's kind of where this episode came from. I said, I've really never talked about the Catskills, and I would like to. And Josh and I, the one place we went to that was not in the Adirondacks was in the Catskills. It was Burnt Rossman Hills State Forest. And we did that last February. Great trip. And it's in Schoharie County in New York. And like I said, we went in February. The first day we were there was very cold and rainy. Not even really snow. It was just like hovering around 32, 33 degrees. So we weren't getting snow. We were just getting a lot of rain. It was very wet. We couldn't even do a campfire. The second night we were there, much better. It snowed. We were able to do a nice big campfire, and we actually recorded a podcast episode. It's episode 34, which again I will link in the description below, so you guys can find it and go back and watch that one. It's actually one of our more popular podcasts. It was the only one I didn't do like really in in my studio here, also known as my bedroom. But we were just kind of sitting at the edge of the lean-to, and I had the camera on my phone going, and we were just talking about whatever came to mind. And it was very much a look into how Josh and I converse when we're just actually out camping. Like I said, we kind of just set the recorder going and started talking about whatever sprang to mind. And this is what we do on every trip, like just around the campfire. We talk about politics, we talk about religion, we talk about the world at large, we talk about personal stuff in our lives, but inevitably the paranormal comes up. I mean, you can't sit around a campfire and not share ghost stories. So we went to this camping trip, Burnt Rossman. We had a lean-to. Great trip. No experiences. We famously joked in the episode that the lean-to was only like a 12-minute walk from where we parked the car. And if anybody has watched Josh's videos, and I'll link to Josh's channel down below, Diaz Wilderness Adventures, most of our hikes are fairly long. I mean, even on the shorter side, you're talking half mile, 3/4 of a mile hike uphill, just very kind of rough hikes. And we did like Faro Lake, which was like a 6-mile hike with, stuff on our back, and dragging beers was a long hike. So this hike was very quick from the car. We had a lot of our gear on sleds. We're just dragging it through the snow. So it was a very easy hike. That being said, where we parked the car was very remote. We're kind of on this back road. There's no houses. There's no businesses. We're pretty deep in the woods. Not, terribly far, not like we've been in the Adirondacks, but still pretty deep. And the entire time we were there, we made many trips back and forth to the car to sometimes to bring back any gear that we were kind of done with, or we knew we didn't need anymore, or trash, when we're done with the food. You don't really, even though it was February, we just didn't want to attract any animals, any possible bears. People were seeing some bears. So they were kind of coming out of hibernation. We just didn't want to attract that. So we'd go back to the car because, again, it's a quick walk. And without the gear, it was probably like 8 or 9 minutes. It was a very quick walk. And there was also this cute little cemetery. I say cute, but, this little old cemetery from way back in the day. And Josh and I went and explored that and took some video there. So, and then there's Looking Glass Pond is right there. So we took a walk around there and just really did a lot of exploring. Didn't run into a soul. Nobody drove down the road. The road is just, covered in snow and just kind of desolate. And there's a trail that runs through right by the lean-to. And we had seen on the register that people had gone through recently. And there was one guy in particular who was doing a really long hike. He was probably out there for 3-4 weeks, just hiking by himself, carrying his gear and stopping along the way to camp at night. So kudos to him. But Josh and I were just kind of hanging out there and being by ourselves and enjoying it. And it was very quiet. Like I said, we didn't run into anybody else. But it was spooky. It was kind of, like I said, desolate, and you're kind of deep and remote. And, we heard things. It was really just the snow and the trees. But it can be creepy, especially at night. You kind of hear when the wind blows and the trees have ice on them, they kind of creak and groan. And a lot of times we thought we heard women's voices. We thought we heard tree knocks, but it was clearly just the ice. So we didn't see anything. I did take a quick little video, like one of our footprints that kind of got morphed into a much bigger footprint. And I kind of used that to sort of show how you have to be careful about anything you see in the woods, in the snow, that melt and rain and double stepping can really make a normal footprint look like a big footprint. And we saw a few of those, but they were ours. We clearly saw that they were ours. They were right on the trail where we were walking. And again, but we slept peacefully. We didn't have any issues that night. But I did do some research and just try to see, hey, are there any Bigfoot sightings around there? And I went to the BFRO website, which I've done before. And there are no sightings listed on there for Schoharie County. And I'm sure there are. I'm sure people have had sightings there and are either just not reported or they're not reported to the BFRO. Gail, I'm trying to get her back on the show. I'm going to reach out to her because I'd love to speak to her again. But she may have some sightings from that area. So I'd love to speak to her about that. But I'm pulling up some sightings from Delaware County, which is in the Catskills. So we're in that area. And the Catskills, for those who don't know, part of the greater Appalachian Mountain range. But they're here in New York, and they're beautiful and they're remote and just really cool place. And I loved being at Burnt Rossman. It was just such a cool trip that we had. But I'm going to go over some Bigfoot reports this week with you guys from the Catskills. Okay, so I'm going to go in reverse order. I'm going to go from the oldest report to the most recent. And there's just 3 here, but they're very detailed, which I like. So bear with me. I'm just going to read through these with you guys and give you my thoughts. So this one is from 1997, October 1997. Hunter hears odd clicking noises while scouting. So I did just mention that Josh and I heard some clicking stuff and noises like that, but this is a little different. So location, this was in the town of Deposit between Highway 17 and Columbia Lake Road on state land locally known as McCabe Hollow. Observed. I heard clicking noises that I thought sounded like rocks smashing together. I continued to hike to my deer stand, paying little attention to the sounds. When I got to my stand, I heard the same sound again. I could not pinpoint the direction of the sound at that time. There was a quarry to the south and a sportsman's club to the east, so I figured there was someone working on either property. Every so often, I would hear about 3 to 5 clicks in a row, and then they would cease. This went on for about 45 minutes or so. I remember thinking it strange that in 9 years of hunting this very spot, I cannot remember ever hearing these clicks. I was able to locate the direction of the sound to be on the ridge bordering the state land and the club's property. I turned my attention to that area, trying to scope the ridge and hillside for the source of the clicking sounds. Finding nothing up there moving and still hearing the clicking, I decided to leave and scout another location. About halfway out of the woods, I heard what sounded to me to be a large animal coming at me. In the time it took me to turn around, the thing stopped. I thought I spooked a deer. As I tried to see the source of the commotion, the thing grunted at me once. The grunt was very loud and close. I still couldn't see it, so I chambered around in my .308 Ruger. As soon as I loaded, it screamed, grunted bloody murder, but it didn't move. I did, and no time did I even get a glance of it. The scream grunt sounded guttural and loud. Never had I heard anything like it, loud and agitated. Also noticed, heard heavy footsteps while turkey hunting in the spring of 1997. Did not see the source, but they sounded very close, perhaps within 25 yards. So this was about 9 a.m. He was hiking to his deer stand when I first heard the clicking, scouting area for deer for about 45 minutes and hearing sounds every so often. Walking back to my truck, I heard the thing scream, grunt. Environment. The area was in a clear-cut pine forest, mountain ridge to the east, bordering the Sportsman's Club. I hiked a logging road to the clear-cut, and I don't know where the road leads to. Stone quarry about a half mile to the south. So this one is interesting because, again, we've heard this before. I mean, the tree knocks have sort of taken over popular Bigfoot culture now, and everybody's hearing tree knocks. But I remember reading about these rock clicks way before the tree knock sort of became a thing. And to me, they're even more interesting than the tree knocks. A tree knock, I've heard tree knocks, and again, 99% of them, I kind of feel like were just the wind moving the trees or the temperature changing, from day to dusk as the sun goes down and the wood just kind of moving. And it can sound like tree knocks. Again, I don't think I've ever had an actual tree knock, something close. But the clicks are interesting because what can take two rocks and bang them together? And that's a very distinct sound. And again, here you have someone who's a hunter, someone who's been in the woods, knows the sounds of the woods. This is land he's familiar with. He never heard them before. And then again, he hears this large animal. And this almost sounds like paralleling. He's trying to come out of the woods and there's something that he can hear, and when he stops, the thing stopped. So I think that's interesting because you do hear a lot of that, and this is from 1997. So a very interesting story. I don't know what would click rocks. Again, true wood knocks, you can blame that on trees, on branches breaking, trees hitting each other in the wind. I mean, sometimes it doesn't even have to be that windy. It could be much windier up at the treetops than it is at ground level. So you're saying, oh, there's no wind, but the wind up there is banging the trees together. So you get tree knocks. And again, I'm not trying to dismiss every single tree knock ever, but I think the vast majority of them are just misidentifications. The rock clicking, again, this is not just boom, boom, just two tree knocks and then that's it. This is the guy's hearing lots of clicking. So very interesting to me. And he says he also heard some footsteps earlier in the year in the spring. So clearly something, and he doesn't see what grunted at him or howled at him. But he says something screamed and grunted. So I don't know what that would be. Again, in New York, we have wild animals. We have bear, we have deer. There may be some wild cats here, coyotes. We don't have much else that would be big and scream like that would not be easily identifiable as a bear or as a big cat. So interesting story. There's no analysis here. I don't know if the BFRO researched this. I know usually there's a section down here where an investigator will speak to the witness and investigate the area or just try to get more information. And there's none here. But again, this was from 1997, and it's very possible that whoever, this Edward J.M., who submitted this story, just didn't leave any contact info. He may have just been wanting to tell his story. And I know a lot of people don't want to talk about it. They put it out there and that's it. They don't want to mention it ever again. So I thought this was a very cool story. So let me move on to the next one. So the next story comes from July 7th, 2004. Multiple observations over a 3-year span. So this says it's from 2001 to 2004. He lists the season as winter, the month of March. So this may have been when it started. Location directions withheld by request. So again, a lot of people, when they tell their stories, and it just says the nearest town is Treadwell, nearest road is County 14. And you'll see when we get into this story, a lot of people don't want the notoriety. They don't want other people showing up on their land or at their home saying, "Hey, where's Bigfoot?" So I appreciate that people really want that privacy. They need to tell their story. Obviously, there's this need to go onto the BFRO and tell their story, but they're really trying to be vague about where this happened, when this happened, because they don't want people showing up. They want their privacy. I don't even see a name here. The other one had a name, but this one is just submitted by a witness. So I'll read this story. Observed. My wife and I have had our farm near Treadwell, New York, in Delaware County since the summer of 2001. The farm is above 130, mostly wooded acres. I don't want to give the exact number of acres to avoid someone figuring out which one it is. And again, in these small towns, people would be able to, so-and-so's got 123 acres. With about 30 acres of fields, with a few trails throughout the woods. The property is bordered by probably 2,000 or more acres of continuous woods, privately owned, and countless more acres of woods and fields that lead all the way up to Canada by just crossing dirt roads, except for one major highway, 88. I've had a fascination for Bigfoot since I was young and read about reported sightings, etc., so I'm keen to notice things that could be attributed to these possible creatures others might not notice. I say possible creatures because even though I have strong feeling they exist, I have not seen one with my own eyes. So let me just stop here because I think this is interesting. A lot of skeptics will like to debunk any witness who, he's already interested in Bigfoot, so he's just seeing, he's got Bigfoot on the brain, so he's seeing Bigfoot everywhere. I don't believe that. I don't believe just because you have an interest in Bigfoot or that you believe in it that you think you see it everywhere. I have an interest in Bigfoot. I believe in Bigfoot, or I believe there's a possibility they exist at the very least, but I have never seen one. So, and I've been out in the woods many times, very dark, deep woods, remote for days. And, I've had a few weird experiences, but I've never actually seen Bigfoot. And I don't say that anything that I've experienced was Bigfoot. So just wanted to get that out of the way. And he even says here, I say possible creatures, because while he believes they exist or strong feelings that they exist, he's not seen one with his own eyes. So I appreciate him saying that because, again, the skeptics will, he's into it, so everything he sees is now Bigfoot. Not the case. So let me continue here. The first thing that happened was not too long after we got our place. We were sitting around a campfire we made not far from the house when we began to hear the sound of wood being pounded against wood coming from what seemed to be our woods up on the hill. The distance up to those particular woods is probably 300 yards or more, but this sound was clear and strong. I told my wife what I thought it could be, and she told me she didn't want to hear any more about it because it frightened her. There was no other explanation that could explain that distinct sound to me, though. I tried to duplicate the sound in the woods by myself, but could get nowhere near the resonance that must have been produced to carry the distance I think we heard it from. On another occasion, I took our dog out for his nightly walk and heard a tremendous short howl, scream, yelp with a whole lot of modulation, so up and down, which is very similar to what I heard. It gave me a chill down my spine. It was just a huge sound. We have coyotes all around here, and I have heard them make some strange sounds. They do. But I've never heard that sound from my coyote. Whatever made that sound, I would imagine, had to be a pretty big animal. It did not seem far away either, so after shining the flashlight along the edge of the woods, I hightailed it back to the house, checking over my shoulder often. Perhaps along the same line, my wife was out with the dog one early evening in the field, and this is the mildest dog you will ever encounter. It has only ever growled while asleep and chasing something in its dreams. My wife told me that she had never seen our dog behave this way, and it doesn't even pay attention to deer when it sees them anymore because it sees them so often. The dog was looking intently at something along the wood line and growling. My wife could see nothing, but the dog saw something that scared it. It may have been a bear, as I have seen tracks and sign occasionally. The last incident, and probably the most convincing to me, are the tracks that we saw in our woods this past winter. We have never been able to get into our woods in the winter because the snow has always been too deep and the hill to those particular woods too steep. The snowshoes that we tried in the past just sunk in the powdery snow. We tried a new type on a snow with an ice crust, and we were able to get into the woods for quite a ways. We came across a trail of 2 pairs of tracks going in a couple of different directions and meeting up again 100 yards or so later that no humans could have made. I at first thought the tracks could have been made by a deer leaping, but the tracks appeared to be a 2-legged stride with one foot pointing a little right and one a little left, alternating perfectly. I am 6 feet tall, and I took my snowshoes off to see what kind of stride I could make, and I was about a foot or two short of reaching the stride of these prints. The prints were pretty old, as they had been snowed on, so I couldn't see much and tried to feel for features like toes, but could not say for sure that I felt any. They were quite long, but the snow could have melted to make them bigger. What struck us was the length of the stride, though. So that is our experience to this point for what it's worth. I only wanted to let you know that there could be something to these incidences. I would not dare ask my neighbors if they have had any strange things happen, even though they are very good friends of ours. I find it ironic that they may have had more significant encounters and may be afraid to say anything to us about it. One neighbor did say they heard what sounded like a deer being attacked and screaming in the woods in the night. They have never heard anything like it, so that was their only explanation. One of them works for an environmental agency that I won't identify and spends a lot of time in the woods. Also noticed nothing that was not covered in the report. Other witnesses. My wife was a witness on 2 occasions. Other stories. I mentioned in my report an incident that my neighbors thought was a deer being attacked in the woods. I've also read on this site of some incidences in this area of the state. The several incidences occurred at different times. The only one that occurred during the day was the tracks. The area where we have our farm is a transitional forest with white pine, many maples, ash oaks, etc. There are streams and several ponds. One pond is about 15 acres. The woods are just packed with unaccountable numbers of blueberry bushes. There are also a number of wetlands. There are ravines that run through the woods. So I do appreciate this guy trying to debunk certain things. So the second story with the dog, I can relate to that. I had a Shih Tzu who, same thing, would never growl, would never bark. I mean, she was just so quiet and so friendly and kind of timid. You know, she had a rough life when we adopted her. She was only like 2 years old when we got her, but she was just very sort of timid and loving. But there was one night in my apartment, she just got up and started growling at nothing. Nothing that I could find or see anyway. So I can relate to that. Again, doesn't really prove that it was Bigfoot, but it's just one of those things you kind of put into that, you know, shelf in your brain that you remember later and say, okay, that was weird. Doesn't mean anything, but it's a weird thing because you know your animal, you know how they behave, how they react. So I thought that was interesting at the very least. The third story about the prints, I appreciate that he was trying to debunk this and saying it could have been a deer, it could have been an animal leaping, that the tracks had melted, they had been snowed on, so they weren't very distinct, but he does mention the stride. So now you're talking about, you know, he's 6 foot tall, I'm 6'1". Again, we can take some pretty big strides. So if this guy is trying to match the stride and he's falling short by a foot or two, that's a pretty big stride. What in the woods could make such a big stride? Again, the biggest animals we really have are black bear, and they don't get very big where we are. For the most part, you're talking 300-400 pounds. If they stand upright, they're probably 6 feet tall, give or take. But they got the short little stubby legs. They're not taking a stride longer than a 6 foot tall man, you know, adult human. So those are my thoughts on that. Again, he is interested in Bigfoot. He mentions that the tree knocks could be Bigfoot. Again, I didn't hear his tree knocks. I know a lot of people will go into very Bigfooty areas, you know, areas that have history of Bigfoot sightings, and they go in and they bang on trees and they get tree knocks back. But my thing is always, you're not seeing what's making those tree knocks. So maybe it's just other Bigfoot enthusiasts in the woods banging on trees, and you're hearing them and they're hearing you, and everyone's just sort of, you know, giving each other confirmation bias and, you know, okay, well, I heard tree knocks, it must be Bigfoot, when it's really just other Bigfoot researchers or enthusiasts or people messing with you. Again, I'm not saying they're all fake. I'm just saying you have to take the tree knock thing with a huge, huge mountain of salt, because there's just so many other things it could be. But this guy had his experience. I don't want to take away from his experience. He did try to duplicate it and replicate it. And I appreciate that this guy does seem interested in Bigfoot, but he also seems interested in the truth and debunking things. And we all have our biases. We all have our, you know, but again, at the end of the day, it's his experience. So I appreciate all that, and very cool stories. So here is A little bit of follow-up. Like I said, the other one didn't have any, but this one, follow-up investigation by BFRO investigator Paul Mateja. After speaking with the witness, the following should be noted. The witness and his wife observed two sets of tracks in the snow. The trackway extended over 200 yards. A typical track was approximately 15 to 16 inches in length and had a human shape. So, as I said earlier, lots of things, especially in the snow, can start looking human-shaped from melt and rain and refreeze and other snow. And so, got to be cautious about that. The tracks looked old, possibly because of snow melt. As I said, the typical step between footprints left to right was approximately 52 inches. The two trackways separated for a time and then came back together. The tracks were seen in March 2003, not 2004, as noted in the report. The wood knocks were heard at 11 p.m. There were 3 to 4 successive knocks, a pause, and then 3 to 4 more knocks. The pattern was repeated several times. There's been no recently observed activity. I don't think it says here when this follow-up was done. In subsequent correspondence with the witness, we discussed further the possibility that a leaping deer had made them. The witness provided the following explanation. I was just up in our woods last week after a fresh snow, and I know the type of track that you are describing. They're everywhere and can go for quite a distance. You can usually see the hoof prints in these tracks where they are fresh. But what differentiates these tracks from the tracks that I saw were, one, the tracks that I saw were more defined in the shape of a large human track, more flat at the bottom, and two, they alternated between right and left more than a deer track, which are pretty much in a straight line when they are leaping. The tracks that I saw were alternating more like a human's walk. The distance between the deer leap tracks is very similar to the distance between the tracks that we saw. That is the only similarity. So yeah, a deer jumping can have that stride, that 52-inch stride, clearly. But deer have small hooves. And if you've ever seen a deer print in mud or in snow, it almost looks like someone took a big stick and just punched it through the snow. You're not getting that big, flat, human-shaped footprint. And even if you have melt and refreeze, I can't imagine how many times I would have to melt and refreeze while still maintaining a track for a deer track to turn into a, very large Bigfoot print. Again, not saying it can't be that, but it's, again, one of these things that skeptics say, oh, it's just a deer, it's just a bear, it's just this. I get that you have to use Occam's razor and kind of go for the simplest explanation, but sometimes the simplest explanation doesn't make sense. So if it's not a bear, if it's not a deer, if it's not coyote, because again, coyotes have very small paws, relatively speaking. So what was it? It could be any number of things. Again, your focus determines your reality. So if this guy is thinking Bigfoot, then the tracks may look a little bit like Bigfoot. The investigator here seems to think that it's possible that it was deer. So I don't know. You guys can let me know what you think in the comments below. But let's get on to our third and final story. Okay, so here we have another story from Deposit, from like our first story. And this took place in the year 2005, in the fall, October. So this, again, happens near Route 8. Observed. My unusual experience occurred during the first week of October 2005. I was scouting for deer in a very isolated and limited access area in upstate New York, accessible by a 4x4 trail. I had scouted another area earlier during the day and had about 2 hours of good daylight left to scout this area. My standard practice is to drive the entire length of the valley to check the parking areas as to see where other hunters are located before scouting. On this day, like most during pre-archery and archery season, I was the only person and vehicle on the 4,000 acres. I turned around and headed up the valley to where I wanted to scout. It was a nice sunny fall day, but the sun was beginning to drop. I parked my truck, grabbed my backpack, and headed down a steep ravine into a creek bed. I crossed the creek and proceeded up the other side of the wooded ravine. There was a field at the top of the ravine that I crossed and a hedgerow that separated a hidden field on top. I wanted to check some apple trees for apples. On the far side of the hidden field is a large pile of rocks that appear to be the foundation of an old homestead. I usually climb on top of the rock pile because it is high enough for me to glass the entire field to the top, which is a couple of 100 yards. I glassed the field and saw nothing, which is odd for that time of day, but not unheard of. Glassed, I'm guessing, means the binocs. Okay, so a deer trail crosses in front of the rock pile and heads into a marsh area with a thicket on the backside of the marsh. The thicket is a few hundred yards wide and then breaks into a mature open hardwood where I wanted to scout for a tree stand location. I was about halfway across the marsh when I heard a very loud, deep, resonating growl or roar. It stopped me dead in my tracks and came from the thicket I was heading into about 100 yards away. I've never heard anything in the woods in my 25 years of hunting like it. It was not a cat, coyote, or dog, and I do not think a bear. I did see a very large bear the season before in this area at 20 yards, but he did not make a sound when I waved him off. He just stood up and looked at me and then turned and ran off about 50 yards before walking again. I had a rifle at the time, and the bear did not see me until I waved at him. He was walking straight down the mountain at me, where I was sitting on stand next to a huge boulder. One year, I did spook a bear out of a small orchard, and he kind of woofed at me as he left the area. But this sound wasn't anything like a woof. It was more like a roar that lasted about 1 to 1.5 seconds. I was shocked and taken aback by it. So to pause here, we do have bears up in New York, and some of them can get very big. Typically, they don't. But as I've mentioned before, usually the bears in New York, when you wave them off or yell at them, they turn and run. Very rarely are they going to stand their ground. They don't want anything to do with people. They know people have guns, and they just do not want to deal with people. The black bear here are very different than the black bear and the grizzly bear and the brown bears out west. So here, again, unless you're really like startling a mama bear and her cubs, you're probably not going to have any trouble with bears. I mean, they're a nuisance. They can kind of come into your camp and try to, scavenge. But for the most part, they're not attacking. And when they see you, they're going to run. So just wanted to throw that in there. So let me continue here. After stopping dead in my tracks, I spotted a big flat rock a few feet away. I climbed up on the rock and took my pack off. Whatever made the noise was very large, so I dug out my hunting knife and put it on my belt. I usually carry a sidearm when scouting, but they are not allowed in this area. That day, I wish I had one with me. So to pause again, certain places in New York, you're allowed to have a shotgun or a rifle without a license, but you can't have a handgun unless you have a license. So I'm guessing that's what he's meaning here. So he's probably in a county where you can't have a pistol with you. So let me continue. That day, I wish I had one with me. I glassed the thicket with my binoculars, but I could not see anything that could have made the sound. After about 5 minutes of looking, I wrote it off as a bear and decided to change direction and go check another field that is over the hill from the field I crossed to get to the marsh, but at the other end of that field. I started walking up the marsh parallel to the thicket, and to my surprise and shock, whatever was in the thicket was walking parallel to me or flanking my right side. To pause again, we hear this a lot, the paralleling. People will be in the woods and they'll hear something kind of matching their footsteps, following them, but when they stop, it stops. When they start walking, it starts walking. And again, skeptics will say, oh, you're just hearing an echo, you're hearing your own footsteps, but anybody who's been in the woods knows when you're hearing your own footfalls versus when something else is there. So let me continue. I could hear it snapping limbs and twigs as it walked. This was something heavy, at least the size of a deer, bear, or person. I never heard anything scamper or scurry in the leaves like a small animal will eventually do if you listen long enough. I could hear it busting through the saplings. At this point, I decided to get out of the marsh and into 75 to 100 yard wide hedgerow that runs between the field I crossed and the marsh. This also would lead me away from the thicket. I could not hear whatever was in the thicket after I got into the hedgerow. I was about in the middle of the hedgerow on an old logging road that runs parallel to the field I crossed to get into the marsh when I ran across something odd. There were 2 trees about 20 to 25 feet in height, bent completely over and parallel to the ground across the logging road. The trees were a good 4 to 5 inches in diameter. There was no obvious damage to the trees, and the trees were alive with green leaves on them. I kept walking up the hedgerow and toward the field at the top. I arrived at the top of the hill and the top of the field I had crossed to get into the marsh. There was a hedgerow that separates the 2 fields. I glassed the second field for a few minutes and saw nothing. I had yet to see any kind of wildlife on this scouting trip, which is something people report, that crickets go quiet at night, birds, squirrels, they'll just not be around when allegedly Bigfoot is around. The sun was starting to get very low in the sky, so I decided to start heading back to my truck. I knew if I followed the top hedgerow down the hill, I would pass a couple apple trees and it would lead me to the top of the ravine. I kept following the hedgerow down the hill until I almost reached the top of the ravine. I stopped to check for deer sign around a couple of apple trees. As I was looking for sign, I heard a series of knocking noises coming from about the area where I crossed the ravine on my trip up into the fields. I would estimate the knocking was 200 to 250 yards away. It was not a woodpecker because the time between knocks was too long, and it was more dulled whack rather than a hollow sound a woodpecker makes. A woodpecker has an almost machine gun sound to it. I heard a series of about 4 or 5 knocks, then 20 seconds later, another series, and then another series. So again, people who are familiar with the woods, who have heard woodpeckers, who have heard these other animals, can usually pick that out. And something in your brain tells you, wait a second, this is not normal. This is not what I usually hear. This is not just normal background noise of the forest. So very interesting. At this point, I got kind of spooked because it seemed whatever was in the thicket had backtracked me to where I'd crossed the creek and ravine at the start of my scouting trip. The sun was starting to set behind the mountain, and it was going to start to get dark quickly. I was literally miles from any main road or person and in the middle of nowhere. If whatever was backtracking me continued to do so, then we were going to end up at the same place, my truck. My original plan was to walk to the top of the ravine, back down to where I had crossed the first time because it is easier to climb back up the hill. Well, that is where I was hearing the knocking noises coming from, so I decided I didn't want to get any closer to the source of the knocking. I headed straight down the side of the ravine into the creek bottom. It's much darker in the creek bottom, and everything was in shades of gray. I stopped for a moment to catch my breath before I started up the other side of the ravine to my truck. As I was standing there catching my breath, I started hearing rocks landing on the rocks in the creek bed a couple of 100 yards downstream from me. I could not tell if they were rolling down the hill and landing on the rocks in the creek bed or being thrown. I could hear the rocks land on the rocks and roll around a bit. This happened 5 or 6 times. So again, you have rocks. Like the first story, we had rock clicking. This story, we have rock throwing. So there are rocks hitting other rocks. So something big was there. Either it's knocking the rocks down, as he said, and they're kind of tumbling down the hill and hitting these rocks, or they're being thrown. But something is moving these rocks. So I will continue. After hearing this, I just headed straight up the other side of the ravine, grabbing trees to pull myself up, and got out of there as quickly as possible. I hit the Jeep trail about 75 yards above where I parked. I made a beeline for my truck, dumped my pack in the passenger side, and drove out of there as quickly as I could, and the trail would let me. It was 4-wheel drive, low range, all the way out. I kept checking in my side and rearview mirrors for anything on the road behind me. I never saw anything on the road behind me. Was it a Bigfoot? I can't say that. I can say that I've never heard a roar or growl like that in the woods. I researched the internet on animal vocalizations, but could not find anything that was an exact match. The closest match was a snarling wolf, but it was not the sound I heard. I listened to the Bigfoot vocalizations on this site and cannot say that is what I heard either. The thing roared or growled once, and it was kind of short. It startled me, and I didn't get a second chance to hear it. After reading some of the reports on this site, the unusual events that occurred that day match other people's experiences. There are also reports on this site that are from the same area as I was scouting. Again, deposit, the first story we talked about. I was back in the area again during gun season 6 weeks later and did not see or experience anything unusual. I usually don't spook very easily and travel the backcountry alone quite often. I will admit that day I was spooked by something. Also noticed, no wildlife activity in the area. So that's another thing that you hear in these Bigfoot sightings. People will notice that the crickets go quiet at night. They'll notice that there's no birds, there's no squirrels, there's no like little ground animals, there's no deer where there should be deer. So very interesting. A loud roar or growl was heard. I found live trees 20 to 25 feet high and 4 or 5 inches in diameter pulled down parallel to the ground over an old logging road. The trees were still alive with green leaves on them. It was very fresh. I heard something in the woods out of sight flanking and paralleling me as I walked. I heard wood knocking noises and rocks being thrown or rolled down into a ravine as I crossed a creek to leave the area. Other witnesses, just myself scouting for deer. Other stories, just the incidents reported on this site. It was late afternoon, sunny and warm. This area is comprised of abandoned farmland, fields, swamps, beaver ponds, pine stands, and oak stands, with a sprinkling of apple orchards. There are also other fruit trees around the old homesteads. There are mountain ridges and a brook that runs the length of the property. So before I get into the follow-up investigation, I just think this is an interesting story because, again, you have someone who's very familiar with the woods. He's a hunter, very familiar with the wildlife, with the land. This is a guy who drives into the woods and goes for miles just scouting for deer, hunting places, where to put his tree stand, where to scope out the deer. Very comfortable. But he hears something and experiences something that is not normal. And like I said, there's that little thing in your brain that goes on alert that is not saying this is Bigfoot or this is, ghosts or this is aliens or whatever, but there's that little thing in your brain that says this is not normal. This is not the typical adventure into the woods. This is not the typical deer scouting adventure. So he had, the tree knocks, which again, I can discount those. The rocks, which are much more interesting to me because I don't know anything in the woods that can pick up and throw rocks other than Bigfoot or other people. And neither one of those are things you're going to want to run into. And then the growl. And that's one of those things I've heard the growl in the woods, in the Catskills. Many years ago, my wife and I at the time heard something that I can only describe as like an ape. It just sounded like an ape roar. And that's the only, it didn't sound like any of the howls on this site. It just sounded like an ape. It sounded like an ape grunting and then getting up to like howl/shriek. And, people in the area were trying to say, oh, it was probably an owl. It was, and I'm like, no, this is not an owl. So again, your own personal experiences are just what that is. And skeptics can say you heard an owl, you heard a bear, you heard this, but in your heart, like that is not something that I should be hearing here. So let me go to the follow-up investigation. This one was also done by Paul Mateja. May 5th, 2006, spoke to the witness via telephone. It should be noted that the area is void of human presence for the majority of the year except during fall hunting season. It has been the witness's experience that even during hunting season, the area is lightly visited by humans. Due to the lack of human traffic, the area could provide a safer haven than other areas in the vicinity. Geographic circumstances or legal boundaries that provide relative safe haven from human traffic are not uncommon in reports describing persistent intimidation. So intimidation is an interesting word because if you listen to this story, if you assume that this is a Bigfoot, it sounds like this creature was trying to chase this guy away. It was trying to intimidate him. It's following him. It's making noise, banging on trees. It's throwing rocks. It's growling. So there's like this almost progressive intensity to the intimidation where it clearly doesn't want this guy here. It's trying to push him out and say, don't hunt here, dude. This is my home. Go away. And to me, that's interesting because a lot of people would have you believe that Bigfoot is out there to murder you. It's going to kill you. It's going to eat you. It's this vicious, murderous, psychopathic predator that is just bloodthirsty. And I don't think that's the case if they exist, because you hear stories like this where if this creature wanted to get the drop on this guy, it sounds like he could have. It could have just reached out, grabbed this guy, eat him, and he's gone, and you never hear the story. But it chases him out, and when it doesn't feel like he's moving fast enough, it escalates. I'm going to follow you. I'm going to bang on some trees. I'm going to throw some rocks. I'm going to growl. It's all of these things trying to push this guy out and say, go home, get out of my territory. So very interesting. So I thought that word, and I wanted to bring that up, the intimidation, because that's what this story sounds like, intimidation. This creature wanted this dude out of there. So let me just finish with this. During a recent scouting trip to the same area, the witness heard a possible vocalization coming from an adjacent valley. The vocalization was distant and therefore very faint, but had a siren-like quality to it. The witness also observed that coyotes started to howl and yap as if in response to the sound. So again, that siren-like quality, there's a lot of clips out there of Bigfoot, alleged Bigfoot calls that sound like a siren. Oh, it goes up like that. And I'll see if I can find that clip and link to it here. but very interesting that he never saw anything. It's just something big was tracking him. And again, a bear is not going to do that. A bear is going to run. A big cat will stalk you, but a big cat is going to try to be quiet about it. They're stalking you. They're trying to get the jump on you. They're going to try to, attack you from behind. And this sounds like it was bigger than a cat. It growled unlike a cat. And again, a big cat can't throw rocks or make tree knocks. So make of this what you will. But those are the stories from the Catskills. So I hope you guys enjoy those. I think there's some really cool stories there. Nothing really seen, but again, those weird things that just bother you somewhere deep in the recesses of your brain where you're saying, this is not right. This is not a bear. This is not a deer. This is not a coyote. What is it? We're in New York State. We're not out in the Pacific Northwest where you have these huge grizzly bears or brown bears, or, up in the Adirondacks, we have moose, and those can be scary, but they're clearly not bipedal, human-like, hairy men. So let me know what you guys think in the comments below. If you guys have had a Bigfoot encounter, please let me know. Jason@oddanduntold.com. Just shoot me an email if you had any sort of encounter, UFO, Bigfoot, paranormal, other. I love hearing like these stories that just don't really quite fit into the, the big three there that I mentioned, like cryptid, paranormal, or UFO. But if you've seen anything, any sort of weird creatures, any weird experiences, let me know. Love to hear. Jason@oddanduntold.com. And before I end this week, I just want to give a shout out to my buddy Andy over at Spooky Island Radio. He's doing his 50th episode this week. So congrats, Andy. I know it's been a rough year for you. And, I just applaud you for plugging on with the show. It's tough. Trust me, I know it's tough doing this week in and week out and trying to find topics and trying to find just the energy to record and to edit and to just keep this going, and then all the social media stuff. So my brother, rock on, keep on with the show. I love it. The Missing 411 stuff is my favorite. I love all your episodes, but I love the Missing 411 stuff. So congrats to Andy. Everybody show him some love. Link in the description below. Go listen to his podcast as well. He's a great guy. Awesome shows. So again, everybody, until next time, rock and roll.